John marched up and down the streets of Soho, taking samples from all the local pumps. He hoped he'd be able to identify some contaminant, but when he got the vials of water home, they all seemed to be clear. John wasn't easily discouraged. He took to the streets again, knocking on doors, asking the same odd questions. Has anyone in the house had cholera? Where do you get your water? Over and over he heard the same answer: the Broad Street pump. There were a few places that had escaped the epidemic, but even these exceptions seemed to point back to the pump. Just around the corner from Broad Street, at 50 Poland Street, there had been only 2 deaths reported at the St. James Workhouse, a charity home for more than 500 of Soho's poorest men, women, and children. Why had the cholera hardly touched these residents while killing so many of their neighbors? The answer was that the workhouse had its own well right on the premises. The other location in the neighborhood that seemed to have been passed over by the epidemic was a brewery on Broad Street. When John Snow asked the brewery owner where his workers got their water, he learned that they were given a ration of beer every day and drank that instead. By now, John was convinced that the Broad Street pump was the source of the outbreak. But there was one death he couldn't account for: Susanna Ellie, an elderly woman living across town in the Hampstead Heath neighborhood, had died of cholera on September 2nd. The date put her right in the midst of the Broad Street outbreak, yet what could her connection to the Soho epidemic be? With a few more questions up and down Broad Street, John got his answer. Susanna's sons operated the Ellie percussion cap factory on Broad Street. Every day they sent their mother a jug of cold water fresh from the Broad Street pump, because she insisted that Broad Street had the best tasting water in all of London. Susanna Ellie's love for water from the Broad Street pump had been fatal. Can you handle the truth? By Thursday, September 7th, more than 500 people had died in an area of only a few blocks. An emergency meeting of the parish council was called. Worried men in tall hats and dark suits gathered in the parish hall to see what could be done to halt the deaths and suffering. Just as they were agreeing that burning sulfur in the streets to disinfect the air was the best strategy, a stranger, sitting alone in the back of the hall, asked permission to speak. The council members listened in astonishment as Dr. John Snow laid out the results of his door-to-door research. The council was skeptical about John's outlandish water theory. However, they reasoned that preventing people from drinking the Broad Street water could do no harm, and it just might do some good. The next day, workmen were sent out with instructions to remove the handle of the Broad Street pump. The spread of cholera, which had already been declining in the neighborhood, stopped altogether. The epidemic was over. But the Soho Parish Council and the London Board of Health were not convinced that contaminated water had caused the outbreak or that the well was a source of contamination. They asked John Snow to continue his investigation and report back to them. One man from the council volunteered to assist John with his investigation, but he wasn't an ally, at least not at first. Henry Whitehead was the new assistant minister at St. Luke's, the local church, and he was convinced that John's theory was just plain wrong. The picture comes into focus. Despite their differences, the shy doctor and the young minister made a good team. Henry Whitehead was just 29 years old, and St. Luke's was his first parish. He was full of energy, and he already knew many of the residents of Soho by name. Day after day, he paced the streets, knocking on doors, trying to track down residents who had fled the neighborhood in the early days of the outbreak. He visited some homes 4 or 5 times until he was satisfied that he'd gathered all the information he could. While Henry walked the streets, John spent hours every night in his study poring over the data they'd collected. Frustratingly, there seemed little left to learn. Then, one night, John tried something new. He took his list of the confirmed cases of cholera and transferred the information onto a map of the neighborhood. He drew a black bar for every case reported from each address. Soon, there were clusters of black bars up and down the winding streets. He studied the map. Something was missing. John picked up his pen and marked in the locations of all the water pumps in the neighborhood. By the time he put his pen down, he saw that he had drawn a picture of the epidemic. The black bars radiated out from the Broad Street pump, thickest near the pump and getting less frequent farther away. He felt certain the map would make an impression on the council in a way his earlier lists and tables hadn't been able to. But he still faced a problem. Could this map convince Henry Whitehead?